So there was an article in The Athletic. Did you read, I forget the name of the guy that wrote it. It's not a guy that I read normally. It was an article in The Athletic on the dysfunction on the Clippers last year.
Alyssa yelled it to me this morning as we woke up.
Oh, really?
She just screamed every word and cackled.
Well, and then Paul George was on the All the Smoke podcast, basically, and sounded like he was throwing Doc Rivers under the bus a little bit in his quotes. But here's something. So basically, the way, then this is things that we had heard before. The way this laid it out is that Paul George and Kawhi Leonard had one set of rules, and the rest of the team had another set of rules, and the rest of the team, on this particular team, that did not work. Some of the things that Leonard and George had. Leonard and George were the only players to have their own personal security guards and trainers. They had power over the team's practice and travel schedule, leading teammates to believe Leonard canceled multiple practices. Leonard was allowed to live in San Diego and commute from there, which often made him late for team flights. They didn't speak to the media for at least 45 minutes after games concluded under the guise of post-game treatment or workouts. This usually resulted in their teammates speaking with the media first and for longer, essentially becoming the public voices of the team. Teammates also believed that Leonard and George were able to pick and choose when they played. Not only did they sit out games entirely, but also at times they accepted or declined playing time in the moment. And here is the thing that I felt most interesting. Obviously, Doc Rivers, coach of the team last year. Teammates had a level of acceptance for Leonard's preferential treatment, as his status as two-time champion and two times finals MVP, and then reigning finals MVP, was indisputable. But George's treatment was more of an issue within the locker room, league sources said. George, while a perennial all-star and all-NBA candidate, didn't carry the same cachet with his teammates. There was a sentiment among certain teammates of, what have you accomplished in the playoffs? Multiple league sources said. And here is why this is interesting to me, is that thing that Paul George got away with that pissed off the rest of the players, I feel like, in part, has been a problem with Ben and Joel over the last few years. In guys that get their run, there's been whispers of Joe playing when he wants to play, Ben doing what he wants to do, doesn't do this thing to help the team, doesn't do any that to help the team without having earned it. I think it was one of the things that Jimmy didn't like. I think it rubs some guys the wrong way. The question is, does Doc Rivers have the energy and cachet to get rid of that? You know what I mean? Here, like, he obviously, the situation was too big for him in LA, probably. Like, all of that was over his head, the Kawhi, and he probably just gave up to a certain point. I guess my question is Doc Rivers coming in here and letting those guys know, until you earn it, like, you don't get to do that shit anymore? What do you think? I mean, it's the big question. I don't know what I think. I'm just curious what you think.
Well, I mean, every team has like their best players who set the tone. Mm-hmm. And some of them are very vocal about it. Mm-hmm. And like, people point to Dame a lot as the guy that is like, he is really the culture in Portland. And like, he does a good job, and he, pulls people aside and says, we don't do that here. And like, this is what it is. And Miami is talked about as like a heat culture. You either buy in or you're out kind of thing. LeBron pretty much set the tone this year in LA, and got a bunch of vets around him, and like everybody followed suit basically. Which is
interesting, by the way, because last year it was a clusterfuck in LA, and this year they figured it out. Obviously, the weight of the Anthony Davis situation was over the team last year. But I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah, and Kyrie forced his way out in Cleveland, and then immediately did a bad job of being like the number one guy, and like quickly talked to LeBron about like, well, I guess I was wrong about how what it's like to be the number one dude or whatever it is. And so Ben and Joel have not been vocal or even really non-vocal leaders, despite the fact that they have been the clear best players in the team, pretty much over the last 4 years. And it's going to be on them to just decide. Like, I think if they don't want to, if Doc doesn't get buy-in from them, both of them have only played for one coach. Brett is the coach that they've played for the longest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Joe bounced around high schools, Ben bounced around high schools a little bit, and then both played 1 year in college. So they only played for Brett. He's the longest tenure guy. So this is a new voice that both of them are going to be hearing from. It's a voice of a guy that has coached a ton of Hall of Famers in Doc Rivers, has won a championship, has obviously had a bunch of notorious failures in the playoffs. But it's got to be a partnership. Like Doc signs this big contract. He comes here. He knows these guys are entering the prime of their careers. Hopefully a long prime is what we want, but like it's going to need to be a partnership where Doc needs to get their buy-in and they need to set the tone for everybody else. And I would include Tobias in that, as he is more of a vocal leader than both of those guys. Because if Ben and Joel just aren't willing to, work the hardest, set the tone, commit all the time, be engaged, that kind of thing. Not to say to be like an honors student and you can't you have to be like rah guy all the time, but you got to be a leader. You got to really be the leader. And if they're not willing to do that kind of stuff, then it doesn't matter what Doc does. Like he's not going to penalize them into well, now we're trading him because we're choosing Doc over Embiid or whatever it is. It's like, as a coach, these guys are the guys that you're coaching have a shit ton of money and all the power in the world and a ton of talent. And they think that their talent should be able to afford them certain privileges that friggin' Mike Scott and Cork Maz don't get because they're replaceable. And so what it's going to take is just buying in and connecting on a human level and deciding that hey, we think that this team is good enough to make a championship run if you guys set the tone and do what it takes. And so I don't know. I mean, I hope Doc can say hey, that sucked last year and here's what went wrong. And I don't want to do that this year. I want to build for something for a long time and all that stuff.
Yeah. I think the most important thing out of that is the leading by example thing is that if being a vocal leader comes second, right? Because the only way you can be a vocal leader is if they buy into what you are and what you're doing, which means you have to care and you have to care more than everybody and work harder than everybody. And at that point, they can't call bullshit on you, right? If you prove you want this more than anybody, if you really, I'm not talking about being a tryhard, but I'm talking about really caring. I mean, to get 13 other professional athletes who are being paid millions of dollars to care what the fuck you have to say, that you have to live it, you have to be it. And I think in their different ways, even though they've both had successful seasons and successful careers so far, I think that is, you can doubt that. And I think to a certain extent, the organization allowed it and let it fester. And I think it made it worse. And it's very important. I hope that there's time. I hope they have done this in time to set them. There's not that they're bad guys. They're not bad guys. Joel is a great guy. I don't know much about Ben, but he comes to work, he plays, all those sorts of things. But to get treated differently than everybody else, you got to be different than everybody else, and they gotta earn it, I think. So I hope Doc Rivers can be the guy. I hope, at least to your point, it's somebody new, that they're shit, new guys here. You know what I mean? I can't be that way with a new guy. So another thing that Paul George said on that podcast was that they hardly ever practiced. Now, teams don't practice very much during the regular season anyway. They don't practice a lot. But for a vet to say that they didn't ever practice, that is weird.
Yeah, and especially I think especially in this
cat.
For sure, especially in a coronavirus season, if somebody fucks up, they're not in a bubble anymore. If somebody fucks up, the team is going to not play for a couple weeks. if there becomes a like, hey, this guy tested positive and everybody's got a quarantine, and now all of a sudden we're done the rest of the month. Like, you are really, it is, in the bubble it was, we're here, we're stuck with each other. This thing can go one of two ways. We can either like form these lifelong bonds like we're in summer camp, or we can just get fucking tired of everybody and be like, this is over. I'm not doing this anymore.
It's a different kind of hard than this is.
And right now this is like you're essentially like looking each other in the eye and being like, all right, I'm not going to fucking get this thing because, my mom or whoever that I live with or whatever it is, like, or myself, that I have this, condition that is, makes me immunocompromised or whatever. It becomes like a real serious thing. And so I think some teams are going to become a shit show. Wasn't there what baseball team was it that there was a big,
the Marlins?
Cleveland?
No, the Marlins.
I think it was, the Marlins had it also, but I think Cleveland had a couple guys that like fucked around, and the other players were like, hey, fuck those guys.
Yes. I think they tried to vote to get them like cut, basically. Like the other players tried to get rid of them. Yes. Yeah.
And so there is like it's such a bizarre circumstances to have a season in. But extreme circumstances promotes lifelong bonds. I don't know. It's a very odd season, but I hope it works out.
Yeah.
And I'm glad it's not going to be on television.
Yes. Just check the box scores in the paper. That's the only place you can see the box scores.